So in this video, I'm going to be discussing Occam's razor. It's often brought up in debates, almost as if it's a hard and fast rule that you have to follow in order for your explanations to be accurate, be true. Somebody will say something like, what you just said violated Occam's razor, as if that means that what you just said was in some way incorrect, which is ridiculous. Occam's razor, and I'm just going to read here one of the original formulations: plurality should not be posited without necessity. This is just saying that if you've got an explanation that works, and there's stuff in there that's not actually pertinent to how it explains the thing, you discard that. And you wouldn't add in other things. So, for example, to explain how I make my cakes, I'm not going to also add in stuff about how I make my curries. That's not relevant. Talking about how to fry tofu has nothing to do with how to bake a layered cake. That wouldn't mean that my explanation wouldn't actually explain the cake if I talked about tofu. It would just make it silly and there wouldn't be a point to the discussion of tofu. Now, people often take this to mean, and I'm going to read again, that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And that kind of can apply, but then they sometimes take out that usually, and that's a huge incorrect step. They'll then say the simplest explanation is the correct one. And I can give you a really quick example of how that would be completely wrong just based on modern science. So based on modern science, we know absolutely that evolution happened. I mean, it's a fact. It's probably the most well-established fact in science. To deny it is basically to deny all of science. So before we had all this evidence, the fossil records, the biological data, you can trace back DNA and determine. It's actually really cool. You can trace back the evolution and changes in one gene between species, and then you pick another gene and you can trace it back and form the same kinds of trees. I saw a special with Richard Dawkins talking about just how you could take like 5 different genes and form the exact same family trees based on the differences that have occurred in those genes. In fact, I'll let Richard Dawkins explain this evidence in his own words.
I think perhaps the single most convincing fact, the observation that you could point to would be the pattern of resemblances that you see when you compare the genes using modern DNA techniques, actually looking at the letter-to-letter correspondences between genes. Compare the genes of any pair of animals you like, pair of animals, pair of plants, and then plot out the resemblances, and they fall in a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family tree. And the only alternative to it being a family tree is that the intelligent designer deliberately set out to deceive us in the most underhand and devious manner. Moreover, the same thing works with every gene you do separately, and even pseudogenes that don't do anything but are vestigial relics of genes that once did something. I find it extremely hard to imagine how any creationist who actually bothered to listen to that could possibly doubt the fact of evolution. But they don't listen. What they do is simply stick their fingers in their ear and say la la la.
Before we had all this evidence, it would have been really simple to just say, just God did it. And that sounds a lot simpler than going through the theory of evolution by natural selection, saying that, they know nothing of genetics, so saying that, there's changes in this, and somehow you can go from little bacterial things to giant things like us, that would seem ridiculous. It would seem way overcomplicated, and it would be right. The simple explanation of a God is the wrong explanation, and we know it. And the more complicated explanation of evolution is the right one, and we know that. Occam's razor is not some sort of a thing that must be maintained. It's not a hard and fast rule. It's just a suggestion that helps you make sure that you're not going off the rails, and that what's in your hypothesis and later when it becomes, or if it becomes theory. By the way, theory is the highest level of information in science, higher than law. Law is just saying, we see this happen a bunch. Theory is saying why this is happening. But But it's just going to get you to pare this down and remove anything from there that doesn't belong so that you have a more elegant, a more proper, a better explanation for what you're talking about. And I believe that's all. Peace. Now, I should qualify when I say that the God explanation is wrong. I'm only saying that the simple idea of God poofing people into existence in some single spot is wrong, based on the evidence from science. That's not to say that maybe some all-powerful being wasn't guiding everything from the beginning. I can't disprove that. Nobody can, as far as I can tell.